This is a video that's been on my radar for a while now. We're finally seeing some sort of a consistent hierarchy in the meta, so I figured it was finally time to make a full dino tier list. Keep in mind that this tier list pertains specifically to the current version of the game. Obviously, dinos will change ranks as the devs make balance changes in the future. I also want to make it clear that this tier list is an overall combat ranking, which basically means how well will each dino fare in a fight against other species in the current meta, and how tough they are to take on as an opponent. I found that a good way to get a decent idea of how strong something is for official servers is to think about how scary fighting a group of them might be. This is, for the most part, how fights on officials go, so I find this method to be a decently accurate gauge by default. Of course, I'll be adding my 2 cents for the rankings as well. I'll be building the list in the order that the dinos come up, and at the end of the video, I'll be reorganizing the individual tiers in order from best to worst, so stick around if you'd like to see what ranks at the top and bottom of each category. So coming up first, we have Achillo. And for me, Achillo is an easy A. If you've watched my channel in the past, you'll know that I think Achillo is pretty strong in the current meta. It's got some pretty solid DPS for a smaller mid-tier, and great survivability against giant packs of dinos. Next up we got Alio, and for me Alio is a D tier dino, which is a bit sad for me to say because I used to really like playing Alio. So the reason I'm putting Alio in D tier is because it really doesn't have the ability to fight like it used to. It doesn't do as much damage, and it's much more frail than it was before. If you see a pack of Alios, you are probably not going to be very concerned, no matter what you're on, except for maybe Raptors. And while Alio is really good at disengaging from fights, it currently gets beaten by most other dinos in this game, which is why I'm putting it at D tier. Next up we have Allo, which I would place probably in the middle or low side of B tier. Allo, even with the bleed buffs, is still not the best in its current state. I personally think it really needs a second head slot so it can also utilize Hatchet Bite as well as your regular old default bite. Because if you currently run Hatchet Bite with claws, you actually lose the ability to do raw damage entirely, which pretty much means that you just can't run Hatchet Bite in any scenario. Allo is obviously pretty good at fighting things below its weight class, but it can't really punch up super well without a lot of help, so for me it's a solid B pick. This one might be a little bit controversial, but I'm going to throw Cerato up in A tier. It's going to be a low A tier for me, but even with the nerfs to Armored Tail and Thrash, I still think Cerato is a pretty decent brawler in the current meta, because it's basically like a slightly tougher Achillo. Between Charge Bite and Default Bite, you can output really high DPS, you've got pretty good survivability, although not quite as good escapability as Achillo, which is why I'd rank Achillo a bit higher, but Cerato is still a pretty solid A tier pick for me. Next up we have Conc, and I'm going to put Conc in C tier. Again, applying the group theory to this, if you see a bunch of Concs running around, in most scenarios you're probably not going to feel too threatened. Even with Conc's recent buffs, it still doesn't have the best DPS, although its bleed is decent, but Conc still really can't brawl with stuff in the B and A tier in my opinion very well, so for now I'm going to stick it in C. And now we have probably the most hated dino in the current meta, which, to nobody's surprise, is going to be thrown up in S tier because Dasp, in its current state, is very strong in packs. And again, applying that group theory here, if you see a pack of Dasps running around, maybe 4, 5, 6, you're probably going to want to head the other direction. Not much in the current meta is going to be able to take on a group of Dasps like that unless you have a large group yourself. Dasp has pretty solid DPS, and when you combine its Bone Break with its really high speed, you just get a deadly combination, especially when paired with other larger dinos, and it's just really hard to play around Bone Break currently, which kind of sucks. So I currently think Dasp is an S tier pick pretty much solely because of the Bone Break. I think if you take away Bone Break from Dasp, it probably falls into the B tier, or maybe low A category. Next up we have Dynan and Latin, and I'm just going to throw these guys in together because they're pretty similar in terms of play, and I'm going to put them both in D tier. And once again, while they can be decently effective in groups, you're mostly not really going to be scared if you see a group of Raptors running around. These little guys don't pose much of a threat anymore, especially after Bleed was removed from their default bite. And they're definitely below Alio in D tier because Alio has a pretty easy time cleaning up Raptors. So I'm going to leave them right where they are for now in D. Next up we have Meg, and I'm going to stick Meg right next to Conc in C tier. This might be a pretty controversial pick again for some of you, but hear me out with Meg. Meg right now in its current state is pretty bad. And I know a lot of people like Meg and are high on Meg, but here's why I think it's not the best pick. It's roughly on par with a Conc in terms of what it can fight. The Heavy Bite does decent damage, but it's really not enough to carry Meg to a higher tier. Meg just really doesn't have the DPS to be a contender in a higher category, and while the water escapability is pretty nice, if you're not careful, it's pretty easy to get stuck out on land and killed within a few seconds. I think Meg loses pretty handily to everything in C tier and above, which is why I'm going to put it right at C tier with Conc. Next up we have Metri, and I'm going to stick Metri in C tier as well, because in its current state, Metri is just really not that good. Obviously, it's a great support rule for carnivores, because carnivores just don't have another healer as is, but if you look at the treatment that Lamb got for its TLC, and then you go back to Metri and look at the Metri rework, Metri really got the short end of the stick here. If Metri had ability packages like Lamb does, it would probably be a B or an A tier. But in its current state, it just has the default healing calls and really lousy damage. I was actually pretty shocked when I checked the damage on Metri's attacks. They're surprisingly terrible. The default bite does as much damage as the tail attack at 20 damage, and the claws only deal a measly 35, which is pretty insane for something of its size. So I'm gonna stick Metri in C tier just because I think the heals carry it to C tier, otherwise it'd be an easy D or E. Next up we have Pycno, and I'm also going to stick Pycno in C tier because even with the health buff, I think Pycno's pretty weak right now. The strongest thing that Pycno had going for it prior to this meta was tap charging, and with tap charging being fixed, I found that Pycno really struggles to win a lot of fights. While it's got great escapability with its sprint speed and stamina drain, it really has trouble soloing a good chunk of dinos in the game. Next up we have Sarco, and I'm going to put Sarco all the way up in A tier. I think that Sarco is a pretty solid semi-aquatic pick right now because they're always a nuisance to deal with. Obviously, you have Clamp for smaller dinos, which can be really frustrating to play around. You've got Asphyxiating Bite, which is very strong. The Charge Bite, which obviously deals a huge amount of damage. And the Default Bite honestly makes it very hard to deal with for other semi-aquatics because of how insanely fast you can attack with it. Next up, we have Spino, and I'm going to put Spino in B tier right now because while Spino makes for a pretty good semi-aquatic, it really is lacking on the land part of its build at the moment. Spino loses to a straight-up face tank against Rex, and its movement feels very slow and clunky on land. A fully aquatic kitted Spino I would probably toss up to the A tier, but just because I think it has some trouble fulfilling its role as a semi-aquatic, I'm gonna leave it down in the high Bs for now. Next up we have Sucho, and again, if you guys watch the channel, you probably know where I'm gonna put Sucho. It's going to be a high A tier pick for me because it's a really solid overall pick. It's got fantastic DPS with Claw Barrage, it's got good escapability being a semi-aquatic, it's got pretty high combat weight for how fast it can move, and it can easily take on things like Dasp. I think a group of Suchos playing right is one of the most deadly things in this game currently. I feel like Sucho is almost in the S tier for me right now, but again, if you're not careful with Sucho and you get overextended, you can easily lose to things that have Bone Break on land. So for me right now, Sucho is a high A pick. Next up we have Rex, and I think Rex currently is a high B, maybe bottom A tier pick. Obviously, Rex has its really high damaging bite, which makes it good, and it has access to Bone Break, which a lot of players are starting to run again now that Dasps are running everywhere with Bone Break, which makes Rex a lot more of a pain to deal with than it previously was. A group of Rexes, though, is still not that intimidating, unless of course you're playing alone and you're on something like another Apex, which a group of Rexes might be able to catch. Otherwise, honestly, a group of Rexes is really not that intimidating because you can just avoid them. And Rex is still killable by a lot of things in the A tier list if you're careful and you avoid Bone Break. Obviously, if you get Bone Broke by a Rex, you should just be dead. There is pretty much no scenario in which you escape a Rex Bone Break. So for me right now, Rex is a very high B, maybe low A tier pick. Next up, we have Alberta, and for me, Alberta is a C tier. Sadly, Alberta has really had no identity in this game for a while, I feel like. I feel like Alberta just wants the best of both worlds, but can't have either in its current state. Alberta has decent DPS, but it really just loses to everything in the tiers above it very easily, and can potentially also be easily overwhelmed by things like Raptors. Its speed and stamina pool just really don't give it the escapability it would need to be a contender higher up on this list, so for me, Alberta is a solid C. Next up, we have Amarg, and for me, Amarg is a B tier pick right now. Amarg is actually a pretty decent option in the current meta. It fights really well against opponents of a lower weight class, and its stomp does a pretty high amount of damage. Not to mention, it's got a much better chance of fighting back against Apexes now, with its tail attack dealing so much knockback. We've been running a bit more Amarg recently now, and I'm happy to say I can put Amarg in B tier, because I feel like previous versions of Amarg would have wound up somewhere on the D or E tier. So I still think Amarg needs some work, but I'm happy for Amarg because I feel like overall it is improving as a dino. Next up, we have Anno, probably the other most hated dino in the current meta for good reason, and I'm gonna stick it up in S tier. Anno right now, with the changes to Hunker, is practically unkillable. There are really only two scenarios where an Anno dies. Number 1, it misplays and leaves Hunker at the wrong time, or number 2, it starves or thirsts to death. Anno has its very large AoE tail slam, which does good damage. It's got bone break. It's got the ability to crouch and become basically invincible because obviously you can't knock it out of Hunker anymore with knockback. So Anno right now in its current state is an easy S tier for me. And if you see a pack of Annos coming for you, there is pretty much nothing you can do other than just disengage. Because fighting 5 or 6 Annos that are all running bone break with tail slam is just almost instant death no matter which way you flip it. Next up we have Bars, and Bars for me is sadly a D tier dino at the moment. I really hope Bars gets some good changes in the future because in its current state, it is basically just a walking meat wagon. It really can't fight back well against other apexes. It loses to most mid tiers. It can be easily killed by Raptors. I mean, there's really not a lot that Bars has going for it at the moment, sadly. So I really hope Bars gets some love, but for now, for me, it is an easy D tier pick. Next up, we have Campto, and little Campto is going to go in E tier because, I mean, let's be honest, Campto is awesome, but it really can't fight in this game at all. The only thing that Campto is really going to be useful for in a combat scenario in the current meta is if it chases down something that's on low HP and keeps it in combat until the rest of the reinforcements arrive to kill it. Otherwise, Campto has pretty much no ability to fight, and its only real strong suit is being able to run away. Next up, we have Deinocheirus, and for me, Deinocheirus is an easy A tier pick. When kitted out with water abilities, Deinocheirus is an insane semi-aquatic pick. I think it's one of the best in the game currently. It has pretty unrivaled water speed, and I've seen ducks solo Spinos, Sarcos, Suchos, you name it. Deinocheirus right now is overall in a pretty good spot. While it's not the best land fighter at the moment, it still has a better stamina pool, sprint speed, and stamina regen than Spino, which makes it a little bit more viable for land combat. Overall though, Deinocheirus is a solid A tier semi-aquatic pick. Next up we have EO, and this probably won't be too surprising for you guys seeing as where I stuck Rex, but EO is going to be a B tier pick for me at the moment. Again, EO is not bad. It's really not. It's got charge, sharpened horns, the default headbutt attack does a lot of damage, but it's going to be in that borderline high B tier, maybe low A tier right now, just like Rex, because it's very similar to Rex. If you see a group of EOs, obviously they're going to be tough to kill, but you can just disengage and walk away. So they're overall not that threatening of a pick unless you're playing something else that's huge. Just like Rex, in its current state, EO can be taken down by a couple things from the higher tiers on this list, like Dasps with Bone Break. It's still a pretty solid pick, but just not quite good enough to get into the A tier category for me at the moment. Next up we have Iggy, and with the current nerfs to Iggy, I think it's going to be a C tier pick for me because most things higher than C tier are going to have a pretty easy time dealing with Iggy in its current state. I know Iggy is still fast and it still has pretty good stamina, but I am nowhere near as hesitant to fight an Iggy as I was in the previous meta, pre-nerf. Hopefully Iggy's ability TLC is pretty good because I really think it needs some help in its current state. Unfortunately, the same goes for our sad little friend Kentro at the moment because Kentro got over-nerfed into oblivion. In the previous meta, again, Kentro would have been an easy S tier pick, but with all the nerfs, I think it brings it down to C, maybe even debatably D tier at the moment, because while it might still be hard to kill, Kentro lost so much of its offensive ability simply because of its turn radius nerfs. This is something I've said quite frequently on stream, but I can play around the health nerfs, I can play around the health regen nerfs, I can play around the damage nerfs, I just can't play around the turn radius nerfs. If any of you played a lot of Kentro before the changes, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Poor Kentro corners like a tractor in its current state, and even has trouble getting around on things like Rexes now. So for me, Kentro is definitely in C tier. Next up, we have Lamb, and I think Lamb in its current state is going to be in B tier for me. Lamb can hold its own pretty well in fights, certainly a lot better than Metri can. It's got pretty good speed, pretty good stamina, and decent escapability, and its new sets of calls really help it out. In its current state, Lamb is a much stronger healer than Metri, and can be far more effective in a combat scenario as well, which is why I'm putting it in the B tier. Next up we have Pachy, and for me, Pachy is going right in the D tier because It's about on par with Alio at the moment, in my opinion. It's got very lackluster DPS, it's pretty fragile, and while it has decent escapability, there's just not much it can do in a fight in its current state. Again, most of the time when I see a Pachy or a group of Pachys, I'm just thinking free trophies. And again, of course, no hate if you like playing Pachy or anything else that's lower on this tier list. This is just a pure rating of combat ability, which is why, for me, Pachy belongs in the D tier. Next up, we have Steg. And for me, I think Steg is a really solid B tier pick. Steg hits really hard and can stack up bleed extremely quickly, so it can be a pretty formidable opponent to take on, even if you're playing a group of mid tiers. I think Steg is currently the most effective bleeder in the whole game. And while it has some trouble punching up against things like Rexes and Eos, it can deal with most other picks in the game with relative ease. So for me, Steg is a pretty high B tier pick. Next up, we have Styraco. And for me, Styraco belongs up in the A tier. Styraco basically took the role of Kentro in this meta, taking on the nimble fast bleeder role. It's got pretty decent DPS, it's got the ability to run down and finish kills for larger herbivore groups, and it can hold its own in fights against other mid tiers pretty well. I'm currently looking at Styraco as roughly the herbivore equivalent of things like Achillo and Cerato, so for me, it belongs up in the A tier. Next up, we have Struth. And for me, Struth belongs in the D tier. Again, in its current state, Struth kind of functions like an upgraded Campto. Really, its only current role in PvP is being a nuisance and tracking down and keeping things in combat that are low HP that the rest of the group wants to finish off. Not a very intimidating pick all around. I think the Struth TLC will change this drastically. When the TLC drops, my guess is that Struth will probably rocket up to the B or maybe even A tier, but we'll have to see when it comes out. Overall, for now though, it's going to stay in the D tier for me. Next up, we have Hatz. And for me, Hatz is going to sit in the B tier. With the somewhat recent changes to its flight stamina drain and its ability to peck mid-flight, I think Hatz is a lot less powerful than it was before. Obviously, it's still a pretty good option if you're coming in to finish off kills or take on something decently small, but overall, Hatz gameplay is a lot more punishing than it once was. So for me, Hatz is a low B tier, maybe high C tier pick at the moment. Next up, we have Thal, and sadly for Thal, it's going to go down in the E tier with Campto because, again, in its current state, Thal just really can't do much. It's basically the flying version of Campto. Its only real combat role is going to be keeping things in combat that are really low HP, or going down and trying to finish something off that rests somewhere nearby. Other than that, there's really not a lot Thal can do in a combat scenario, so for me, it's going to go down in the E tier. Next up, we have our two full aquatics, and I'm just going to place them together because for me, they are both easy A tiers. Both of these guys can obviously dominate in aquatic combat, and while Kai can output a lot more damage than our little dolphin friend, Eurhi has insane water speed, making it a fantastic pick if you want to run circles around other semi-aquatics. When played right, Eurhi can actually be a very deadly foe. I've actually seen a Eurhi take on multiple Sarcos before and win. So again, both of these guys are easy A tier picks at the moment, but obviously they are full aquatics, so that drastically limits what you can do with them. And last but not least, we have Ramph. And Ramph for me is going to be a solid F tier pick because it cannot deal damage in its current state, which is a bit sad. At the very least, I wish Ramph could do some bleed damage or have some sort of combat role, because at the moment, it basically just functions as a noisemaker or a trophy thief. So it's going to be a solid F tier pick for me. Okay, so that is every single dino placed onto the tier list, and now we're going to go through each category and rearrange them from best to worst within the actual tiers themselves. So I'm going to leave S tier as it is. I think that Dasp is really strong. I mean, obviously so is Anno, but we're going to leave this one as is. For our A tier, Achillo is going to stay where it is. We're going to drag Sucho up to this slot, Deinocheirus up to this slot, Sarco up to this slot, Styr up to this slot, and Cerato is going to drop down here below our full aquatics. For the B tier, we're going to drag Spino all the way up to here. Rex and Eo are going to stay where they are because I think that they're borderline low A picks. We're going to move Amarg up one slot. Lamb's going to move up as well, and we're going to leave the rest of it like this. For the C tier, we're going to slide Iggy all the way up to the front, followed by Albert and Kentro, and then Metri, Meg, Cerato, and then Pycno. I don't think we need to bother organizing the D tier list too much, but I'll do it anyway. I think that in its current state, Alio beats the Raptors, so we're going to put the Raptors here. The Raptors can beat the Bars, so the Bars is going to go here, and we're just going to move Struth up to here because it's slightly harder to kill than Pachy. For our E tier, we're just going to leave it as is. I mean, this really doesn't matter. You could kind of flip these guys either way you'd like. And Ramph obviously stays where it is in F. So I really hope you all enjoyed this tier list. This is obviously my first time doing something like this on the channel, so please leave a like if you enjoyed. I've been your host Conware, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.